All right, Bobby, thanks so much for joining me tonight. Man, you have one heck of a resume, tons of crazy experience. We've been connected on Instagram for a while since I posted about the cocaine sharks, which you have a funny story about, and I want to hear about. But FBI special agent, you're on the dive team. We're going to get into all that tonight and some of your experiences. Plus, you said you're going to do some writing, so I want to hear a little bit about
Sure.
that as well. But like, tell me about tell me about the cocaine shark story real quick before we get into kind of your history.
Sure. So in 2011, we were called by I was running the FBI dive team, and we were called by the Coast Guard. And the Coast Guard has this, surveillance C-130s fly along the coast of South America, Latin America, up into Florida, that cocaine pipeline. And they get on these semi-submersibles, they call them, self-propelled semi-submersibles. So they're SPSSs. And then, so they're not fully submersible but we call them cocaine submarines, for lack of a better term, although they don't completely submerge. So they have a little bit of a pipe sticking out for ventilation and stuff like that. Well, the C-130s with their heat-seeking equipment detect them, and so they got on one. It was sunk on purpose. They have these scuttling valves that the crew of four goes down and basically scuttles it so the cocaine goes to the bottom. Then they float in with life preservers and wait for the Coast Guard to pick them up. And so on this one occasion, it didn't sink in deep enough water. It hit kind of a shelf at about 95 feet. So we were called in. The Coast Guard at that point had divers, but they were only on the MSSTs, which are like their kind of tactical divers for kind of ship takeovers and things like that. They didn't have the FBI dive team was more like Navy salvage divers. So we go deep and we stay down and we gather stuff. And
Gotcha.
so they called us and we actually trained them on that. So I think they may have that capability now. But they called us and we did two that year for them. We flew to Pensacola. We got on a buoy tender actually because they wanted to give us one of their new high speed Homeland Security, but the freeboard on that is way too high for our divers to kind of get in and out of the water.
Mm.
The buoy tenders were perfect because they have that cutout that's kind of right at the water's edge, so there's not a lot of freeboard. And so we went down to about 150 miles off the coast of Honduras, where they had a cutter kind of stay on station guarding that location, and we dove down. We spent about 8 days cutting into the submarine and getting about $650 million worth of cocaine back to the surface.
Wow.
Now, when you're cutting into this thing, and sometimes you go too far and you hit some of the some of the kilos underneath and stuff. And so the captain of the ship we were working off of, made one rule: no loose cocaine on his boat. He didn't want any loose cocaine.
Mm.
So if we kind of broke into a package underwater, we would just kind of dissipate it, kind of shake it out and let it go and let it dissipate into the water. We're 150 miles off the coast. We're not really concerned about too much of that. And so we did on occasion when you're pulling out these 20 and 30 kilo packages out of there, you might rip one open. And so you kind of bust it out. And so the fish, we could tell the fish were kind of coming around a lot. And then there was one, at least one occasion where myself and my partner were doing our safety hang for a couple of minutes, but at about 15 feet below the ship. And we looked down at the submarine and we saw a shark circling it. And then basically following our lines up, because we're on umbilicals, we breathe surface air down there. And so we can see the shark coming on. We've got helmet cams and things on us, so topside can watch and everything and hear us. We've got full helmets on. And, I told him, I said, hey, Doug, there's a big shark coming up at us. And this thing just circled us. It swam right through this cloud of cocaine that we had left in our trail to come up. And then it started circling us. It nibbled on his fin. I think it realized it wasn't food. Then it came over to me, circled me, and then it just kind of moseyed off. It looked like it was, very relaxed. And I can't tell whether that's from having ingested the cocaine that it just swam up through or not. It didn't act crazy like that movie Cocaine Bear, I think it was, which is also a true story, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my cocaine shark story.
Wow. But you were an attorney first, right?
He was. Yeah, I was. My brother was NYPD. My father was NYPD. I was on the list to go NYPD, and I was going to be a cop and a lawyer, because unlike the FBI, the NYPD allows you to kind of moonlight. You could actually have a job. So I knew a couple of guys that my brother worked with on the NYPD who were lawyers in part time, and so that was my plan. And then the FBI called. They talked to my dad. He was retired at the time, living in Florida, and he's the actual one talked me into going going with the feds. Said there'd be more travel, a little more variety. They treat you a little better, and he was right in all those aspects and stuff. And so I had a really, a great career.
So you did good. You went to law school and everything.
Yeah, I graduated law school, finished law school. I got a few jobs offers as an attorney, and I actually accepted one, and then the FBI called, and I had to decline that, and I went right into the FBI Academy.
What was kind of your thought process between the FBI and being an attorney and dollar figures and all that stuff? Like what drove you to
Yeah,
go the FBI route?
it was tough because I'm from New York, and I was from Long Island, and I was going to law school with a lot of guys who, men and women who, were the kind of Wall Street pipeline. They were going to be
Mm-hmm.
making a lot of money. And I stayed friends with them, and I talked to a lot of them. And obviously they made more money than me. But for the first 8, 10 years, they were working for the partners in these big firms. They were making money, but they were working, 18 hours a day behind a desk,
Oof.
and I got lucky because right after the FBI Academy, I got sent back to New York, and I was working the Italian mob. I was doing stuff like you'd see on Goodfellas. In fact, the movie Goodfellas was based on my squad. Henry Hill, who is played by Ray Liotta in that movie, was an informant on my squad when I got there. And so the stuff that you see in Goodfellas, the little bit of the FBI you see at the end of the movie, that was basically what I was doing, following around guys like that, and making cases and making these big RICO cases, the Pizza Connection case. It was kind of the heyday of organized crime too, because it was when Sammy the Bull started cooperating with the government, and so this, the FBI, the mafia's omerta, or their code of silence, was broken, and so now you had underbosses, and you had all these big time, high ranking mafiosi kind of coming over, and so it was really a good time to be working the mob, because there was a lot happening at that point. Then a few years later, I transitioned to gangs, and I became kind of the team leader on a team that focused on the Jamaican posses, the big dreadlock guys. And this is the late 1980s in New York. It was crack alley. Crack had taken over New York, and a lot of violence. We were working the Jamaicans who had in the 70s had set up all these marijuana, kind of street level marijuana things that nobody cared about, and so they let them flourish. But when they got a new product in, crack, they were in perfect position to be the distributors, the street level distributors stuff. They had,
Right.
they pushed it out to all their marijuana outlets. And so they were making, one of the gangs I was working was making 800,000 a week in cash.
What?
And so, yeah, there was a lot of money. And
Wow.
when you have a lot of money like that, you have a lot of violence. And so I think we had 2,200. We broke the record in 1990 with homicides in New York City. I think we had 8 a day. We had 2,245 homicides. So I was working a lot of homicides. The Jamaicans were just, it was a really violent time in New York City. And, it was in the middle of it. We were doing 3, 4 search warrants a week, kicking indoors and chasing guys. And it was really the Wild West, but it was really, as a young single guy is where I wanted to be.
Throughout your time investigating the Italian mob and the Jamaican gangs, like, did you ever have those moments where you were like, "Oh my God, like this could be the end"? Like you feared for your life. Like I'm sure there was, but like, I mean, is there anything you're
Yeah.
willing to talk about? Like, kind of break it
Well, yeah.
down.
Look, we at one point had as many FBI agents working drugs as DEA did because we had so many more agents than they did in New York, and so we worked task forces with DEA and with NYPD, and there was almost nightly you'd hear from another squad or whatever, so and so, oh, C-23, they got to a shootout tonight with the Colombians or whatever, and you'd hear things. And in 1988, I remember the night Everett Hatcher, he was an undercover DEA agent, was killed in Staten Island by Gus Ferracci, who was an Italian mobster guy. Well, he was a mobster. I was saying wannabe, but he had just gotten out of prison, and they were doing a deal undercover. And to this day, there's some controversy of whether he knew Everett was an undercover or not. He just was going to rip him off. and he pulled up alongside in the car and shot Everett in the head. And the backup team got there too late, and we lost Everett. He wasn't on my squad, but we were working something else that night and heard, and we responded and stuff. So yeah, and another friend of mine, the DA, was doing a warrant and opened a closet, and the guy shot him square in the chest, but he had one of those ceramic plates, and it ricocheted up into took his chin off. He survived. He was disfigured a bit, but the ceramic plate saved his life. But he forever he had to have a lot of cosmetic surgery and stuff and reconstructed on his lower jaw. But those kind of things were commonplace, and we were, like I said, we were kicking indoors probably 3 or 4 nights a week, and it was exhausting. But as a young single guy in that life, that's where you wanted to be.
Is some of the stuff that Hollywood portrays about the mob accurate, or is it over embellished, or is it kind of spot on with the level of craziness and things that you have heard and seen?
Yeah, I mean, some of it is accurate and some of it's not. I mean, I would say the accurate part is how cutthroat they can be and stabbing each other in the back. And you know, like in Goodfellas, when they kill Joe Pesci, they say he's going to be made. So they lure him in, and it's actually two guys that he knows very well that shoot him in the back of the head. That's really accurate. That's kind of what they do. There is no loyalty to each other. I would say there's loyalty to the family, and that's why they do it. And and those guys know. They say, like, I always knew if I was ever going to get whacked, it was going to be by somebody that I trusted, somebody that I knew. And so what that does is it breeds such distrust of each other. Like, if you're a good buddy of mine and we've kind of come up in this organization together, but I know if I ever piss them off or I ever do something that they're going to want to whack me, you're going to be the one that gets the ticket. So how do I really ever comfortable with you? It's going to be the people that are closest to you. So it really breeds this paranoia. They never really show that much. They show the guys whacking each other, but they don't show like that. They're always friends face to face, but they stab each other in the back constantly. They're not the brightest guys in the world. Not Goodfellas. Sopranos showed that, how knucklehead they can be. The Godfather series made them seem a little bit too smart, a little too businesslike and stuff. They usually rely on other people that are not associated with them, like that run businesses, like run restaurants, and they'll come in and take over by force. But they're not the brains behind that business. It's usually a businessman that's being either extorted or threatened,
Okay.
that's making the money for them.
What is it like? I'm sure there's still some kind of existence of the Italian mob and all that today, but like, is it on the same level, or is it really toned down? Have they gotten smarter about things? And what's the FBI and NYPD really kind of up against today?
Like almost across the board with all crime, the mafia did the same thing. Obviously, the guys are much younger now, and what that does is, they're much more computer savvy. So they're doing a lot of computer crimes where, they used to do prostitution and loan sharking and, that kind of stuff, where now they're doing investment frauds, they're doing Ponzi schemes, they're doing these computer-based crimes because they're smarter. Not smarter per se, but they're like more savvy with
Yeah,
computers, right?
they've
And
gotten
all
smarter.
crime. And I think that's across the board, right? I mean, even bank robbers, still have note jobs, but like, now it's easier, or it's, to break into a bank on a computer and steal,
Yeah.
millions of dollars through a, denial of service kind of thing. So I think that they're still active. They're just not as active as the way we have been brought up on them to think they're like the strong arm guys, although that still exists to some extent. But the more we move each year away from that, the more they're online, they're doing computer crimes. It's more anonymous. It's everything else that helps criminals. They know that, and so they're still involved in unions and stuff like that. But it's more sophisticated because they're now using the computers more.
Mm. Yeah, well, like even like the Taliban and Al Qaeda and all those groups, got smart and got online, and the propaganda, the cyber crimes. I mean, they're all starting to do
Oh
it and
yeah,
have been doing it for a while. So it
sure.
doesn't surprise me. I was just curious as to what kind of level of existence they have still to the day, and I think that's interesting. How long were you in? Um, how long were you in the FBI before you started the dive team, and how did the dive team kind of cross your plate?
So I went in the FBI in '87, and I got on the dive team in 1995. So in 1995, an email went out in the New York office. I was in the New York office, which is, I still think, the flagship of the FBI. It's the biggest office we have, the best cases. And it was the only dive team in existence in the FBI. And it was kind of housed in what we call our Special Operations Division, which is like our surveillance teams and our technical teams, the guys who kind of the black bag guys who break into houses and plant microphones and cameras and things like that. And so they got so busy, and there was only like 6 or 7 guys on the team, and they got so busy that they had to open it up to the criminal side of the house, which is where I was. And so they said, we need like 6 more, basically doubling the size of the team, part-time divers. So everybody was part-time. So those guys were still working for special ops. They were still doing all their surveillance and the plane stuff and the cameras and microphones. And then they added us, and there was a tryout process and a selection process. Okay. Oh, sorry, my wife's computer is talking to me. And so I tried out and I was selected. And so I was put on the team. So my main job was still every day to go and work the Jamaican posses. And then I would train, once a week, once every 2 weeks with the team after basic school. You have to go to basic, which was 2 weeks. And then you're on the team a year on probation while you go through some specialty training for the first year. What happened for me, so in 95, I get on the team. So I'm still working my investigations, my drug and gang investigations. And about a year into my time on the team, just when I was about to come off probation, or I just came off probation, TWA Flight 800 explodes off of Long Island. So it was a 747, at that point, the largest commercial aircraft carrying passengers, flying from JFK to Paris, and it exploded 13 miles off the coast of Long Island with 230 souls on board. And we were immediately dispatched. I was to do interviews the first night because most of our gear was down in Atlanta because it was 2 days before the opening ceremonies of the Atlanta Olympics. So half of our dive team was down there at Lake Lanier, diving under the stands. The rowing competition was going to be on Lake Lanier. And so they had these stands built that went up, like the substructure went like 30 feet down into the water. And so we were diving that every night, making sure nobody got in there and planted any devices on there. And so that team had to stay in place. So 6 of us that were I was supposed to go down the next day, Thursday, the day before opening ceremonies, but Wednesday night, July 17th, 1996, TWA Flight 800 crashes. And so everybody came up. The Navy sent 2 ships up from Virginia, salvage ships, NYPD, fire department in Connecticut, Massachusetts. Everybody was there, and we were there. And we spent the next 4 months diving on that crash. And we brought up 90% of that aircraft and at least identifying material on all 230 victims.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable considering, an explosion like that big of an aircraft, almost 300 people. I mean, being able to recover that much is a lot, especially when it comes to, a family member who knew they were on that flight. But, you probably know that they didn't make it, but at the same time,
sure.
That closure is heartbreaking as it is. It still does something for our family to know, okay, they weren't just lost forever, because I think that would be really hard to swallow.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, they're still doing that after 9/11. I mean, they're still working on identifying people, and every couple of months you hear like somebody was identified. As odd as that sounds, if you go to the museum at downtown New York, you still see people. This person was just identified last year or something, and here we are, like well over 20 years later, and they're still working on identifying people, and it's for that reason, because the families deserve that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, when you were on the dive team, you traveled the world doing this, correct? To include going to Alaska, which to me, diving in Alaska seems quite insane. It's one, the water's cold. 2, there's a bunch of ice. Like, I can't imagine circumstances, but you have done that.
Oh yeah. And so by 2002, the FBI lab was setting up crime scene teams in every FBI office. Well, they were already set up, but they wanted more dive teams because the New York team got so busy. So I was tasked with, and it was only because the team leader at the time did not want to be full time. He wanted to stay on his special operations team. And so they turned to me, and I had been working, I think, about 16 years in gangs at that time. And I was a little burnt out. And they said, "Do you want to do this?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "You'll be the first full-time guy. All you'll be doing is diving. 100% of your duties will be diving. But the first 2 years is setting up the program." So I really had to build it right. So I went to the Navy, the U.S. Navy. I went to the Army down in Fort Eustis and their dive program. I went to NOAA. I went to academic dive programs, scientific dive programs, commercial dive programs in the Gulf of Mexico. And I talked to all these people. We did a best practices study. I worked with our FBI laboratory. I worked with our FBI legal teams. And I kind of built the program and the SOPs of the program to service the best we could, our clients who were the prosecutors and the lab technicians who would be basically examining anything that we brought up from the water. And so it was a good 2 years of intensive study and liaisoning with everybody in the dive community, and coming up with our SOPs and things like that. And then I built out the 3 other teams: Washington D.C. field office, Miami field office, and the Los Angeles field office. So by 2004, we had 4 dive teams up and running.
Wow.
And I later transferred out to Los Angeles and was the team leader on that team, when I retired. In 2011, I took our team up to Alaska, north of Anchorage, where a serial killer had kidnapped, raped, and murdered a young barista who was working in one of these coffee kiosks in a parking lot of a mall. And he abducted her, and then he dismembered her, and he hid her under a frozen lake. He pretended to be an ice fisherman. So he'd go out on the ice, set up one of those little tents that the ice fishermen do, take an auger, drill a hole in the ice, and put part of her down. And he did that 5 times. So there were 5 different pieces. So when he was ultimately caught, he told us where she was, and we went down, we went up. It had already frozen over, and we cut new holes in the ice, and we found her, Samantha, and we found all 5 pieces of her, and we brought her back. And Israel Keys was his name. There's a book called American Predator. He's probably the most vicious serial killer that no one's ever heard of, kind
Really?
of. Yeah, and actually, you can actually see him on YouTube because he ultimately hung himself in prison. And so the FBI released all his interrogation tapes. So you can see him on YouTube talking about his planning of some of these killings and stuff. I think he gave us 11 victims before he hung himself. We think he probably did over 30. There's different estimates on that.
Wow.
I've been on numerous documentaries about Keys. There's I think a feature film project now in the works from that book, American Predator, about Keys and things like that. But yeah, it's chilling if you look at his YouTube videos. Him laughing and discussing, this thing like you or I would talk about a fishing trip. But that in running the dive team, we dealt with that, a lot of that kind of stuff, recovering victims, a lot of children that were victims of predators and things, and then notifying the families that their child was found. But it was a difficult thing to do.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. What was it like diving underneath the ice? Knowing that you had to come up to a certain hole and you couldn't just rise back up to the surface. I've never dove
Yeah,
before. I've done the little scuba thing with the snorkel on a
sure,
vacation,
sure.
and that's it. But I can't
Yeah.
imagine going in that cold of water under the ice, knowing you have a lid on you essentially.
Yeah. Well, we dive like Navy salvage divers, so we have these big umbilicals. So you can breathe for days under there
Oh,
because
okay,
it's an
okay,
unlimited supply of air. You're not going to run out of air, and you only have to follow your umbilical back to the hole because that's where it's going to be. That's where your tender is standing topside, tending your umbilical. So yeah, and the thing to remember about diving under the water is that we're in dry suits, and so you wear layers and layers of wool clothes under your dry suit, and you're in a helmet. But also, water can't get colder than 32 degrees, or it becomes ice. So you're in that water at 32. The guys standing topside, it could be 20 degrees and 15 knot winds. So they're a lot colder standing on the surface of that lake. We
okay.
often put pallets down so you don't have to stand with your feet directly on the ice because you will freeze on the surface. It's actually the diver sometimes is the warmest person on the site.
I never thought of it
And
like that. That's
yeah,
interesting. That's interesting.
yeah, people don't. And the other thing is too, on a lot of lakes, and this happened to us in Colorado, you have to remember to put sunblock on because especially in Colorado, if you're at altitude,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, the sun hits the ice and reflects back up into your face. You get burns. You can get sunburnt in 20-degree temperatures because you're at altitude. The sun is so strong and the ice is so reflective.
Yeah.
You know, and nobody thinks about, you know, you're going on a cold trip, you pack in your dry underwear, you have gloves, and sometimes you forget the sunblock, but you do need it in places like that.
I've known so many people have went and gone skiing in, Colorado or Utah or something like that, and they got sunburnt, and they're like, I can't believe I
Yeah,
got sunburnt. Like, well, you're up at altitude and the reflection off the snow. It kind of makes sense, but you just don't.
yeah,
You think of sunburn, sunscreen, and you think of the beach. You don't think
right,
about
exactly.
skiing and all that, but it
Yeah,
does. It makes total sense. I lived in Colorado for a little while, and just being at elevation, spending 30 minutes outside here is not going to get me sunburned, but 30 minutes outside there would get me a
sure.
little red. It's just crazy the
Yeah,
difference in a mile in elevation and what
yeah,
it can
and we
do.
have to
Yeah.
calculate all that also when you're diving at elevation because it's different. Your dive tables are all different at elevation, so you have to there's a different formula you have to use when you're diving at anything pretty much above 500 feet in elevation. You know, and when we do our medical plans for our missions, you know, if you have to evac a diver, you have to have a helicopter, and they have to be instructed not to go over 1,000 feet in elevation if the diver is suffering from a barotrauma. So if you have the bends or if you have some kind of AGE, which is an arterial gas embolism, you know, it's all pressure related. So you can't now go up. So, you know, that's why people a lot of times will go on a vacation and dive for 8 days and then they come back. A lot of times in LAX, we get people landing in LAX and get the bends because they don't realize when you go up in an airplane, you're going to 8,000 feet. A commercial aircraft is usually pressured at 8,000 feet. Well, the bubbles that you've accumulated of nitrogen in your blood, now when you go to less pressure, less pressure, less pressure, because you're going to altitude, those bubbles are getting bigger and bigger and bigger in your bloodstream. So we
Mm.
we always had the rule that you can't fly within 24 hours of diving. You have to let those bubbles shrink and basically get absorbed back into tissue or into your bloodstream, because as those bubbles are still there, when you go to altitude in an aircraft, it's going to expand. And a lot of people they're going on vacation, they want to squeeze every last minute to dive out, and then they jump on a plane and they go to 8,000 feet. And that's even if you're at 35,000 cruising, the cabin of the plane is at 8,000 feet normally. And so they get the bends and they don't even realize it. And they land at LAX and they have the symptoms of decompression sickness, and they don't even realize how they got it. But yeah, there's a hyperbaric chamber near LAX that deals with a lot of that.
That's really interesting because I've seen it in like movies and stuff like that but I never really thought about like, oh, if you dive 100 feet down, that's 100 feet less you can go up because of
Right.
that very concept. And I don't think that would have ever crossed my mind if you hadn't have said that because I just
Right.
wouldn't have done the
Yeah.
math. I'm not very good at
Yeah.
math
People don't
anyway,
think
but
about it. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. And that's why people get dehydrated on planes, or because they're at 8,000 feet altitude. I mean, some of the newer planes, I think the Dreamliner, the 787, I think they may be pressurized to a little less, so they actually do something with the air that helps not get you dehydrated. But you know, you're at altitude, you're going to get dehydrated quicker. You're going to need to drink more water, just like if you were climbing a mountain. You know.
Now, something that you put on your bio when you scheduled this was that you actually went to Iraq. Something I don't
Mhm.
think people understand is I think they tend to think the CIA goes worldwide, the FBI stays kind of at home. We know you already talked about one trip where you were doing the submarine thing well outside our borders. There's a stigma behind that, but how true is it? Is the FBI supposed to operate here? Do they operate worldwide? And what has your experience been doing that?
The FBI operates worldwide. We have a very different mission than the CIA. So we don't necessarily, it's not necessarily a duplication of efforts. We don't really, we cross paths on the intelligence side, but on law enforcement side, you know, I think the first FBI overseas office was in London, opened in 1947. We have overseas offices, they're called legal attaches or legats. And we have them in probably, I don't know, 95 probably now, maybe over 100 embassies, usually in around the world. Almost every major city and major country in their capital, in the U.S. embassy, there's an FBI office. And it's anywhere from a 2-agent office to, like in Mexico City or in London, you probably have 15 agents assigned full time to that office. They're mainly liaison, but they do a lot of other things as well. They work with the CIA, they work with their international partners. So we have agents everywhere. When I got to Iraq, my first tour in Iraq was in 2005. I was over there as a trainer. So I took a training team. I was the senior guy on a training team. And so we were training the Iraqi police in how to do investigations, how to write up reports, because up until then, the police really didn't do anything. The military did everything. Right. And there was no constitution. And so this was early, right? I was in 2005. So the Coalition Provisional Authority, Paul Bremer and his team were actually helping fashion the new constitution there and stuff. So we were teaching them how to do interrogations and stuff, And so I had interpreters, 2 of whom I've moved back here to the States. And we were teaching them how to do surveillance, how to do, and it was really a culture challenge because they didn't know our idioms, and I had to tell my guys, don't use stuff like in a nutshell because they won't understand when they do the translation, those kind of things. And they also said, like, we're going to do a role play of an interrogation on the stage today, and they were like, well, where's the hood? We got to put the hood on them, and where's the rubber hose? And we go, no, we're not hitting anybody with a rubber hose. We're doing this. This is the way you're going to do it. You can establish a rapport. You're going to find a common thread with that person, even if it means lying to them, and you're going to develop some kind of trust, and then so that was my first foray over there. I did I think about 6 months or 5 months of a training mission that was kind of completely in the green zone. And then, I was stationed in the green zone. There was some training that we did outside at some FOBs, but minimal. And then got back to LA in 2006. We had the unfortunate case of 5 U.S. soldiers raping and killing a 14-year-old Iraqi girl. And then killing her mother and father and 5-year-old sister. And this was the subject of a movie made by Brian De Palma called Redacted. It was also in a book. It wasn't the subject of the book, but was in a book called, I think, Black Hearts, which is basically they had a reporter embedded with their company from Fort Campbell. And so that reporter wrote the book about the 9-month deployment they were on. This incident took place just before their 9-month deployment ended. In March, I believe, of 2006. So by May or June of 2006, when they were back in Fort Campbell, 2 of the 5 involved were already dishonorably discharged because of other things, not the crime that we're talking about. And so 2 of them were basically civilians. So the FBI Louisville, Kentucky office had the case on them, and they were working it jointly with CID, with Army CID, who had the 3 that were still in the service, active duty, and in Fort Campbell. And so we worked it jointly. So we got the call because the SecDef called the FBI director and said, we understand you have divers. We need divers outside the military community to come in here and do an evidence search for the weapon, the father's AK, that was used, that these soldiers used to kill the family. And so we went over there and we went into an area called Yusufia, near a village called Yusufia, which is Muhammadiyah, Yusufia, and I can't remember the third, but it was called the Triangle of Death there, south of Baghdad, which is where we had lost more troops than any other place in the country. So they actually gave us a force protection unit from the Philippines because they wanted to, and this was high level negotiating that I wasn't involved in, but they wanted a force protection unit around us from outside the theater, from outside Iraq. And so this force came in from the Philippines, and they kind of surrounded us. They inserted us, Black Hawks. Our gear arrived in a caravan of Humvees, and I had to pick the 2 guys that rode in the Humvees, and the rest of us were inserted via Black Hawk in the middle of the night. We waited till first light, and then we dive ops, and then we extracted that in the middle of the night. They wouldn't tell us, they would just say, be ready, and we'll give you about 10 minutes notice. And then, we scrambled out into the field and they picked us up. But so we did that thing, and all 5 were eventually convicted, 2 in federal civilian court, and then 3 court-martialed. I think 2 got the death penalty, and 2 got life, and 1 got 20 years. One guy the young kid. He was the one that was basically unaware what was happening until it happened. And he was told to stay outside the house and tell them, alert the guys inside the house if anybody was coming. So he really wasn't he was bullied into doing that, and he wasn't aware. And then when they got back to Kentucky, I think he had a crisis of conscience and went to his pastor, and his pastor said, you got to go to your commanding officer. And that's how the whole thing broke, I believe.
I do.
But
I
yeah,
remember that story. That was absolutely insane. A sequence of events that happened, and it's disgusting. It's not representative of the military as a
no,
whole. But wow,
no, not at
what
all.
a tragedy, that's for sure. Because it was just, whoa,
Yeah,
you
I
couldn't
mean, and
believe it.
if you read the book, you know, there was so many failures on so many levels, especially leadership. The lieutenants, they were hanging up in the green zone. They had these kids had no leadership down there. They were in a meat grinder. Their buddies were getting blown up. Not that this is any excuse. I'm not
Sure,
even saying
no,
it's like
right.
any excuse, but it was a meat grinder. They were getting guys killed left and right, and maimed and wounded and dismembered. And if you read that book, Blackhearts, you really kind of it comes to the forefront where there was not a whole lot of leadership for these kids down there, and these were grunts. These were just infantry grunts, and they were basically down there with no supervision, and it was a recipe for disaster. The real ringleader of them was a really bad guy. I mean, he probably would have been, in jail back in the States for something if he hadn't been wearing, if he hadn't joined the army. And he was given the death penalty, and he took the coward's way out, and he hung himself in jail a couple of years later. Specialist Green, I think was his name, Greene, and he hung himself in jail a couple of years later before they could carry out the sentence.
Hmm. Now let's switch it up a little bit and talk about how you got involved in kind of the Hollywood scene, Criminal Minds Beyond Borders, the Criminal Minds TV show. You're doing some stuff on Netflix, and how did you get into that upon retirement, or was it before retirement? How did that happen?
No, yeah, it was after retirement. Actually, I retired in August of 2014 and moved to Brazil, to Rio de Janeiro. My wife is the executive producer of the Olympics, so we go from Olympic City to Olympic City. So I went to Greece. The FBI sent me to Greece in 2004. I worked in Salt Lake in 2002. And so when I retired, I moved down with my two big dogs to Brazil, and I was spending the first year of my retirement walking my dogs along the beaches of Rio, and it was a pretty good retirement.
Sounds
And she
pretty
was going
good.
to work every day. I'd stop at the market and I'd cook for her and have dinner ready for when she got home. And me and the dogs had a great time. And I started writing a little bit of my memoir and things which is still 10 years later, still in the works. But I got a call on one of my trips home. We would come home once in a while do home trips. And then I actually literally was heading back to Rio, and in Atlanta on a connection, I got an email from this group of former agents or retired agents that said, "Hey, we've got this new show. It's a spinoff of Criminal Minds." And I knew the guy who was in Criminal Minds, who basically it's based on, Jim Clemente. And so, my wife said, we're going to be moving back to LA anyway in another year and a half. So why don't you see if you can go back and forth? And so I called them, and literally I landed in Rio, was back on a plane two days later because they needed me right away. And I became the technical advisor on this new show called Criminal Minds Beyond Borders. And what it was a group of profilers, just like Criminal Minds is, but they do all the overseas cases, which again, nobody knew we would do, but we did. And so every week they were conceivably in a different country. And so Gary Sinise was our star, and this is actually Gary's shirt, his foundation. He's still a good friend of mine. We text all the time. Gary and I worked 2 years together every day. And so we had a great cast, and it just didn't hook on. It was one of those spinoffs that didn't catch an audience. And so after 2 seasons, it went off, and they brought me back over to the mothership, the regular CBS show, which was now in its 13th year. It was a big hit. And I went into the writer's room. So in the first 2 years, I was on set. I was working with the director, the actors, how to hold a gun, how to handcuff somebody, how to avoid crossfire, how to do the physical things
Right.
of being an FBI agent. And then when I went back to the mothership, I was in the writer's room, and they already had one FBI agent in there, retired FBI agent, who was a profiler writing. And I basically became a story consultant and helped the other writers with different things, aspects of scenes or rewriting scenes or dialogue related to the FBI's work from there. And then they let me, and then so me and the other FBI agent who was on the show for years, he let me co-write an episode with him. And so I wrote one of the four, and last season, before it went off the air on CBS. It's now back on the air on Paramount Plus, but it's a different type of show. But yeah, so I was able to co-write an episode, and I got into the Writers Union, the Writers Guild, and then I got picked up on a Nicole Kidman crime series, and I wrote for that for about 8 months. And then we wrote all 10 episodes and we were done. And so, yeah, so now I'm a screenwriter. I do, I do still do technical consulting and technical advising. That's what I did on this new Netflix series coming out on the 28th of November called The Madness. John O'T is a friend of mine, an actor. He played an FBI agent. He does play an FBI agent in that series. And I kind of would, he would kind of Zoom me and we'd talk about, and he says, my character's doing this and how would he relate to his supervisor? And, this is, and so we would go over the internal workings of the FBI and how a veteran FBI agent might relate to his supervisor who's younger than him, that kind of thing, because that was my experience as well. And so I do that. I'm writing a couple of pilots, TV shows. One is a comedy about the FBI, which you never see,
Right.
and
Yes.
one is a series about the dive team. Take the show SWAT and turn it into the FBI dive team, and then I'm writing a feature based on not the case in Iraq of the 5 soldiers, but the case of the 12 divers that I put together that basically dropped everything on a moment's notice and flew into the middle of a war zone to pursue justice for a 14-year-old Iraqi girl. It's in its like the 3rd iteration now. It's a challenge because, like you said, the last thing I want to do is make a negative movie, and so it's been a very subtle process of using that as the backstory without it seeping too much into the forefront of the story.
Yeah.
But it's what brings the emotional impact to these guys. Several of them had children themselves, going out on this job and volunteering because we couldn't force anybody to go, so it had to be a voluntary thing. But I wanted to pick the right people for the job, because a team like that in those environments, everybody has to get along together, and you can't have, no matter how good their skills are, if the guy's going to be cancerous to the team concept and the team dynamic, you can't have them there. And so, most of the guys were former military who were FBI agents that we were selected and stuff. So that's the feature that I'm writing now, is kind of about that, but it's been a challenge.
And now are you also getting into novel writing? Is that what I see that correctly? You're going to try to
Yeah.
crack at that?
Well, I mean, only because Hollywood's such a crazy thing that so many, you write a script and now they want it based on IP, right? Intellectual property. They want it based on a book. They want it based on a series of books or even a magazine article or something. So I literally wrote 2 things that I got told, hey, take this script and turn it into a novel. And then once the novel's published, then sell the concept as a TV show or a movie based on the book that you already wrote. And I'm like, well, that's like, I've already written the script. And they go, I know, but these development executives, they want to base it on some IP.
Yeah.
And it's almost a cover their own butts type of thing, because, they get to always say, well, I didn't really advocate for that. I just thought it was a good book. And so, I just thought it would translate, so it is a kind of a funny thing. But yeah, I am turning 2 of my scripts into or I'm trying to into novels, and that's become a challenge because you always hear about adaptations, which means somebody adapts a novel into a movie, right? Well, I'm in the process of doing the reverse. I'm adapting a screenplay or a script into a novel, and so it's kind of the cart before the horse. But that's kind of the craziness of Hollywood these days.
But I've heard about that in the publishing industry, that some of the big name authors, and I won't name any names, have developmental deals with their publisher and with Hollywood. So they develop a story. They don't write the full book. They just developed a story, and then they pitch it to a publisher and pitch it to Hollywood at the same time. If Hollywood says yes, then the publisher says, okay, write the book.
Right.
You have it both secured, which is brilliant. Because even if Hollywood doesn't produce the movie or series, it doesn't go anywhere, but they've already bought it. Like you have that hook already. So to me, it's crazy to think of like that. Like you would think, and I think that's how it used to work. Is like it would take books years and years later and then turn it into a movie. Well, now it's like, hey, we need stories. If it's a legit story, we're going to turn it into a movie, a TV series, and you're going to write the book. Like the book might be the smallest piece of the whole thing.
And the publishers sometimes don't, not that they don't care how well the book does, but they also know that once the movie comes out, if it's popular, people run back and buy the book. So
Yeah.
it can actually stimulate both sales. Like,
Yeah. It's
oh, I
growth.
read that book, I'm going to watch the movie. Well, actually, people say, I saw the movie, now I'm going to want to go read the book.
Yeah.
Um, and so it actually stimulates book sales once the movie comes out. So,
Oh yeah.
and yeah, that's kind of the paradigm that exists right now with writing. That's kind of new in the last 3, 4, 5 years. I've seen that change, and that's kind of where I am. And and like in novel writing and feature writing, two completely different
Oh yeah.
animals. I actually, when I was in the writers' room at Criminal Minds, I was in there with one of the guys, very good TV writer, was also a novelist, and writing novels was a passion. And he used to say, "Well, I write novels because it's my passion. I write TV because it pays the bills." Because he can churn out a TV script on a show like Criminal Minds very quickly, where his novels took a year, 2 years, sometimes longer to write and stuff. So the payoff is not immediate, and it's not as great, from the residual standpoint, especially if you're on a hit show like Criminal Minds, that's then sold into syndication and is on Netflix, and you get a check every time it shows on some streamer somewhere. So yeah, it's two different worlds, but I mean, some of of course, so story is story, right? So
Yeah.
you know, um,
I've
yeah.
heard
So
that
it,
about
it
scripts though. Like a 2 hour movie might be like 100 pages on a script.
Yeah, I mean, generally it's 1 minute per page, but
Okay.
it depends if it's an action. If there's a lot of action, that changes. If there's a lot of overly dialogue, it changes. So yeah, But I mean, it's a very very general rule of thumb is and that's because like our Criminal Minds scripts, we used to have 43, 44 minutes of television with commercials built in on CBS, and our scripts would come in the high 40s. 52 was about the max you'd be allowed to get, but usually around 40, 47, 48, 49 pages would be a good target for
Mm.
a 43-minute TV show.
Wow. That's
It wasn't
crazy.
an hour TV show, but with commercials, you're probably looking at 43 minutes.
Wow. So what else are you working on right now? What's kind of in store for 2025?
Uh, Podcast. I think I may get hired to host a podcast soon. Actually, it's with my agent, the contract. So, um, it's for a major outlet, and it's for their true crime podcast. I do a lot of true crime appearances on TV, like on Oxygen and ID and stuff, and I get called in to do America's Most Wanted. Basically the talking head type of thing. I just was in San Francisco doing a series for Hulu, and so I do a lot of that, and that pops up, and they're quick, usually 1 day jobs or 2 day jobs, and but really, it's getting these two books written. It's about the Iraq case, and then I'm doing an anthology, and it's really hard because it's an anthology of stories based on a bar in Iraq that the FBI ran. That It's kind of mash meets cheers kind of thing, and yeah, it's a great story engine, and I'm trying to again. We pitched it around Hollywood, and no one would buy it because it was based in 2005, and everybody said, I likened it though to Hogan's Heroes, which was pitched in 1963, which was barely 15 years after World War II. And I used to say, like, can you imagine pitching Hogan's Heroes, saying we've got this lovable Nazi, Colonel Klink and Sergeant Schultz, who the audience is going to love, and the network executive saying, the Holocaust was 15 years ago, and you're telling me that you're going to have two lovable Nazis, Colonel Klink and Sergeant Schultz.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that conversation? But somebody took a chance on that. Somebody, and Hogan's Heroes was a hit. But it made it frustrating when I'm sitting there in these pitch meetings, and these young executives are like, well, it's too far away, the 2005, can you have anything? I'm like, well, the war's over. We can't set it modern day because it didn't happen modern day.
Yeah.
We're talking about a bar in Iraq, that was frequented by, French commandos and Gurkhas and Polish intelligence people, and, all of these interesting characters, and the stories just flow. And so now I'm writing that as an anthology,
Very
basically a
cool.
book of these stories, I'm trying to find the narrative thread that I can connect them through, and then I'm going to pitch it as a TV series afterwards because nobody bought it as a TV series. So I'm writing it as an anthology of these stories because I was there in 2005 when we opened it. We actually called it O'Neill's after John O'Neill, my boss in New York, who had retired. Jeff Daniels played him in the Looming Tower, and John died in the North Tower. The South Tower. I think his office was in. Yeah, the South Tower when it collapsed. He was up on the 40th floor in his office. But yeah, so O'Neill's is the name of that project. So I'm hoping to kind of really, really hammer that home in 2025.
Well, that's cool. Well, thanks for joining me tonight. I appreciate it. What you have a website, right? Where can people go to find more about you?
Yeah, just it's bobbychacon.com, and they can see some of my appearances in there, and also on all my social media is just Bobby Chacon FBI. I just tried to make it as simple as people can find it. I tried to do just Bobby Chacon, but for those boxing fans out there was a very big boxing champion. I think he was a 4-weight class champion and named Bobby Chacon. And I knew that when I went to get my SAG card, and they wouldn't let me have Bobby Chacon as my SAG name because Bobby Chacon, the boxer, had it already. So if you do a Google search of me, it doesn't come up in the first 4 or 5 pages because Bobby Chacon, all the videos of this boxer. I always put Bobby Chacon FBI. I attached FBI because Bobby Chacon, the boxer, is much more famous than me. And I often get asked if I'm related to him or anything. But on Twitter or now X or Instagram or Facebook, it's all Bobby Chacon FBI. They can get me there. I mean, it's not real exciting. Sometimes I'm on Fox News. Sometimes I'm on MSNBC. I'm a pretty moderate guy, so I get called for all the stations. I'm not beholden to one. And I think the day after Trump was shot, I was on Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC back to back to back, 3 hours in a row in the morning. So I don't get kind of pigeonholed because they know that I'm kind of a down the middle type of guy, and I just give them the facts, and I don't do a lot of opinion stuff. Although lately on my social media, you might see much ironic chagrin. I think after tomorrow, hopefully, I'll scrub my social media and get rid of some of the electronic stuff. But it's been one of those times. But I can't control myself. But